She almost left him on the first day. Evelyn Hartwell had spent an entire year falling in love with a man's mind, his words, his honesty, the way his letters made her feel seen in a way no one in Philadelphia ever had. She had crossed 1,000 miles of wilderness for him. And then she saw him. Worn boots caked in mud, a jaw that hadn't met a razor in days, hands like slabs of bark, no greeting, just a short nod and a gesture toward a wagon that smelled like cattle. She almost turned around and got back on that train. The letter arrived on a Thursday, which Evelyn would always remember because Thursdays were the days her mother held her weekly tea circle, and Evelyn had been sitting in the corner of the parlor pretending to care about the price of imported lace when Maggie, their housemaid, slipped the envelope onto the side table beside her untouched cup. She recognized the handwriting immediately, that careful, slightly slanted script that had become as familiar to her as her own reflection. G. Hale, Powder River County, Wyoming. She excused herself from the parlor before she even opened it. It wasn't that the letter was secret. Her mother knew about Gideon Hale. Everyone in the Hartwell household knew about Gideon Hale, though their opinions of the arrangement ranged from politely confused to barely disguised horror. What Evelyn couldn't stand was the idea of reading his words in front of them, of letting their raised eyebrows or careful silences creep into the margins of something that belonged entirely to her. She read it at her writing desk with the door closed. Miss Hartwell, I'll be honest with you. I've started this letter 4 times and thrown away 3 of them. The others were more polished, I think, but less true. I'm sending you this one because I figure you deserve the truth more than you deserve a man who's good at saying nothing the fancy way. The ranch is what it is. Hard work, long winters, and enough silence to drive a person to talking to the horses. I won't dress it up for you, but it's mine, and I've kept it alive through 2 bad droughts and 1 cattle plague that wiped out half my neighbors. I'm not telling you that to brag. I'm telling you because I want you to know what kind of man I am. I stay. When things get hard, I stay. What I'm asking you to consider, and I know it's a considerable thing to ask, is whether a life like that holds any appeal for a woman like you. I've read your letters enough times to know you're sharp and curious and tired of being neither of those things out loud. Wyoming is no Philadelphia, but it's real, and I think you might be a woman who values real. Think on it. Write back when you're ready. Ji Tao, Hale. Evelyn read it twice, then a 3rd time. Then she set it down on the desk, pressed her palm flat against the paper, and stared at the wallpaper for a long moment. She was 28 years old. In Philadelphia in 1887, that was a fact that people mentioned in certain tones. Gentle, apologetic tones, the way you mentioned a beautiful horse with a slight limp. Her father had been quietly circulating her name among appropriate families for 3 years. 2 men had expressed interest. One had breath like old cheese. The other had 13 opinions about women reading newspapers, none of them favorable. She picked up her pen. Mr. Hale, I value real very much. When do you need an answer? If Harpart will us. The correspondence had begun 11 months earlier through an advertisement in a periodical that Evelyn's closest friend, Ruth Albright, had shoved under her nose with the kind of delighted wickedness that only a happily married woman could muster. Wyoming rancher, Ruth had read aloud, barely containing herself. Age 34. Seeks educated, clear-minded woman of independent spirit for correspondence leading to matrimony. Must be willing to work and willing to be honest. References available. References, Evelyn had repeated. He's asking for references or providing them? It doesn't specify. Isn't that marvelous? Evelyn had taken the periodical home mostly to prove to herself that she wouldn't respond. She'd sat with it for 6 days before she wrote her first letter, and even then she hadn't told anyone she'd done it, because the whole thing had the embarrassing quality of something a desperate woman would do, and Evelyn Hartwell was not desperate. She was, however, desperately bored. His first reply had surprised her. She'd written him something measured and intelligent, a careful self-portrait designed to convey education and composure. His response had cut straight through all of it. You sound like you're applying for a position, he'd written. I'm not looking to hire anyone. Try again. She'd been furious. She'd also written back the same afternoon. What followed was something she had never quite been able to explain to Ruth or to herself. They argued, often. They disagreed about politics, about the role of government in managing Western land, about whether education or experience built better judgment. He was plain-spoken to the point of bluntness. She was precise to the point of sharpness. Neither of them was particularly gentle about it, but somewhere in all of that friction, she had come to know him. Not a performance of him. Him. The man who had taught himself to read cattle futures and weather patterns with equal fluency. The man who described a sunrise over the Bighorn Mountains in one sentence and dismissed it completely in the next because he had fences to check. The man who admitted, in one letter, that loneliness on the ranch was a physical thing sometimes, like weather, and that he handled it the way he handled actual weather, by keeping busy and waiting for it to pass. She'd loved him before she'd ever seen him. That was the truth of it. And then she stepped off the train in Clearwater Junction, Wyoming, and her carefully built understanding of Gideon Hale collided with reality, like a wagon hitting a rut at full speed. The station at Clearwater Junction was less a station than a wooden platform with optimistic ideas about itself. Two men sat on a bench sharing a tobacco pouch. A dog of indeterminate heritage watched the train arrive with mild suspicion. The platform itself had a sign painted by someone whose spelling had been approximate. Clear WTRJCN, ELEV, 4,210 feet. Evelyn descended from the train car with her two trunks and the hat box that had somehow survived the journey intact, which felt like the last victory she was going to have for a while. She stood on the platform and looked around. He was leaning against a wagon post about 20 feet away, and she knew immediately it was him because he was looking at her with the focused attention of a man who expected to be recognized. He was tall, which she'd known from his letters. He'd mentioned it almost apologetically. I tend to block doorways, which is inconvenient and occasionally embarrassing, and she'd found that charming. The rest of him she had not accounted for. He was somewhere north of Weathered. His coat was canvas, not wool, and it was the color of something that had been brown once and had spent years negotiating with the elements about that. His hat had a slight dent on one side that suggested either a strong opinion or a low-clearance barn. His face, beneath the hat, was lean and deeply lined in the way that outdoor men got. Not old exactly, but well used, like good leather left in the sun. He had dark eyes, a jaw with at least 3 days of stubble, and the general posture of a man who had never in his life needed anyone to feel comfortable on his behalf. He was not ugly. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that he was nothing like the voice in her head. For 11 months she had been reading his words in a particular register, thoughtful, measured, dry, and she had unconsciously attached that voice to an image she hadn't quite acknowledged constructing. The man in her head had been not precisely refined, but somehow gentled by his own intelligence. She had imagined someone whose exterior would carry some visible trace of the interior she'd come to know. What she was looking at was a cattle rancher. Completely, entirely, unambiguously a cattle rancher. From the boot mud to the calloused hands to the way he stood like he was already calculating how long this was going to take. He crossed the platform in about 8 strides. "Miss Hartwell," he said. His voice was lower than she'd imagined, and flatter. The Wyoming distance was in it, that long plains vowel. He held out his hand, not to take hers, but for a handshake. She shook it. His grip was brief and matter-of-fact. "Mr. Hale." A pause. He looked at her trunks, then back at her. 2 trunks. "Yes." "Anything in them that can't survive a rough road?" "My books, possibly." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but a slight relaxation of the line around his mouth. "We'll put them on top and go slow on the creek crossing. The wagon bed's dry." He picked up both trunks like they were boxes of nothing and started loading them. He did not ask if she needed help. He did not offer her his arm. Evelyn stood on the platform and breathed the cold Wyoming air and tried, carefully and rationally, to locate her panic. She found it immediately. It was sitting right where she'd left it, between her ribs, and it was saying something she really didn't want to hear. "You don't know this man." She knew his letters. She knew his mind on paper. She knew his opinions on railroad regulation and the ethics of dry land farming, and the particular tragedy of what happened to the Sioux after the Treaty of Fort Laramie. She knew he took his coffee without sugar and that he'd read David Copperfield twice and found it sentimental both times but kept a copy anyway. She knew he had a dog named Frank that had died the previous spring. and that the paragraph describing it had been the only time in 11 months that his letters had felt raw and unguarded in a way that hurt to read. She did not know what he looked like when he was angry. She did not know if he was the kind of man who raised his voice or the kind who went quiet. She didn't know whether the equality and respect he'd described in his letters was a real thing or an ideal he held about himself that reality hadn't yet tested. "You coming?" he called from the wagon seat. Evelyn Hartwell picked up her hatbox, walked to the wagon, and climbed up beside him without his help, because there wasn't any offered. The wagon pulled away from the platform. She did not say anything for several minutes. Neither did he. Then, because silence had always been a thing, she fought with language. "How far is the ranch?" 4 hours. Maybe 5 if the North Road's bad." He paused. "It'll probably be bad." "I see." Another silence. The town of Clearwater Junction, 3 streets, a general store, a saloon, and a church with a listing steeple, gave way to open country with a kind of abrupt indifference, as if the land hadn't bothered to wait for civilization to finish itself. "You're quiet," Gideon said. He didn't take his eyes off the road. "I'm observing." "What are you observing?" She hesitated. "That Wyoming looks exactly like the letters said it would. And that you—" She stopped herself. "That I don't." He said it without particular feeling. "I didn't say that." "Didn't have to." He shifted the reins in his hands. "I know what I look like, Miss Hartwell. I've known it for 34 years. Doesn't keep me up at night." She looked at his profile. He was watching the road with that same flat attention he'd given her at the platform. Competent, unruffled, entirely himself. "Was that accusatory?" she asked. "Was what accusatory?" "Your tone just then doesn't keep me up at night. Were you suggesting I'm being shallow?" He turned and looked at her then, for just a moment, with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. "I was suggesting I'm used to it," he said. "That's all." Evelyn turned back to the open country ahead of them and felt the particular discomfort of a person who has been seen accurately. The North Road was indeed bad. They hit the first serious rut about 40 minutes out of Clearwater Junction, and Evelyn grabbed the wagon bench with both hands and said something under her breath that would have made her mother's tea circle turn to stone. Gideon glanced at her sideways. "Sorry," she said reflexively. "Don't apologize to me for it. The road deserves worse." He navigated around the next section with a careful patience she hadn't expected. He seemed to know exactly which parts of the road were treacherous and which were merely irritating. "Freeze-thaw cycle," he said, mostly to himself. "Does this every November? I keep meaning to grade it myself, but it's 60 miles of road and one of me. Why doesn't the county do it?" He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Because the county commissioner is Joseph Whitmore, and Joseph Whitmore is currently involved in a lengthy personal disagreement with the territorial legislature over grazing rights. And in the meantime, the roads have been something of a lower priority. That's politically irresponsible." "Welcome to Wyoming." She found herself, despite everything, almost smiling. His voice in person had that same quality his letters had. The dry current beneath the surface. The observation delivered without performance. At least that part was the same. "Tell me about the ranch," she said. Not because she didn't know, he'd described it many times, but because she wanted to hear him talk and calibrate herself to the reality of his voice. He considered this. "What do you want to know?" "Whatever you think is important to tell me." He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that meant thinking, not discomfort. 640 acres. About 400 of it is usable range. The rest is too rocky or runs too steep. I run about 280 head of cattle right now, which is probably the most the land can handle responsibly. I tried pushing toward 300 2 years ago and paid for it come August. He paused. Main house is livable. I want to be clear about that. It's not grand, but I've been working on it. I winterized the back bedroom last October, and the stove draws properly now, which it didn't always. It drew badly. It would occasionally fill the kitchen with smoke, which is its own kind of warmth, just not a useful one. You fixed it yourself? Had some help. Cal Briggs, my closest neighbor, he knows stoves. His wife Nora brought a pie the day we finished, which I think was more for her own celebration than mine. She'd been eating dinner at my place often enough, and the smoke situation had not been ideal. Evelyn looked at him. You have neighbors who eat dinner with you regularly? Had. Nora had their third child in the spring. They don't get out as much. He glanced at her. Don't worry, I can cook. Not well, but competently. The meals won't be elegant. I can cook as well. I know, you mentioned it. Did I? I don't remember mentioning it. March. You were writing about your mother's housekeeper leaving, and you said you'd taken over the cooking for 3 weeks and discovered you were, your words, serviceable but uninspired. She stared at him. He'd remembered a parenthetical detail from a letter she'd written 8 months ago. You have a good memory, she said. I read your letters more than once. He said it without embarrassment and without the tender inflection that would have made it performative. Just a fact. Evelyn faced forward again. The grassland stretched ahead of them, vast and winter pale, the mountains a blue weight on the far horizon. She had seen illustrations of the West, of course, paintings, engravings in magazines. None of them had gotten the scale right. The scale was something that pressed on you. You felt small inside it, but not unpleasantly, more like a letter inside a very large envelope. Mr. Hale, she said, you can call me Gideon. I think we're past formality given. Gideon. The name felt strange spoken aloud. She'd written it and read it so many times it had become almost abstract. I need to say something, and I need you not to take it poorly. All right. I am genuinely uncertain whether I've made the right decision. I want to be honest with you about that because I think you've always valued honesty above reassurance, and I think I owe you honesty right now. He didn't answer immediately. The wagon moved through a shallow crossing, water just below the wheel hubs, and he kept his attention on the horses until they were through. I appreciate that, he said finally. You're not upset? Should I be? Most men would be. Most men would rather hear what they want to hear than what's true. He shifted the reins again, a small adjustment. I told you when I wrote that first letter that the ranch is what it is, and I wouldn't dress it up. That goes for me too. I'm what I am. You get to decide if that's enough. I'd rather you decide honestly than stay out of obligation and be miserable. Evelyn absorbed this. That's a remarkably sane position. It's a practical one. A miserable woman running my house doesn't benefit either of us. Is that the only reason? Practicality? He thought for a moment, and she had the sense that she'd accidentally gotten closer to something real, the way you sometimes stepped wrong in a dark room and found a wall you didn't know was there. No, he said, but I figure there's time for the rest of it. They rode in silence after that, but it was a different kind of silence than before, slightly less defended. They arrived as the last flat light was leaving the sky. Hale Ranch sat in a shallow valley between two long ridges, the kind of placement that spoke of someone who had understood both wind and water when they chose it. The main house was long and low, built from timber that had gone gray with weathering, with a covered porch running the full width of the front. Behind it, a barn, 2 outbuildings, and a corral where 3 horses watched their arrival with the blank, evaluating attention that horses had. It was not grand. He had said it wouldn't be, but it was solid. Evelyn had grown up in a house that was very beautiful and somewhat hollow, full of furniture selected for impression and rooms used only for guests. The Hale Ranch house did not have a single pretentious bone in its construction. Every beam was where it was because it needed to be there. A young man came out of the barn when they pulled in, 17 or so, hay in his hair, a face full of freckles, and the particular gangliness of someone who had grown 6 inches in the last year and hadn't finished negotiating with his own skeleton. That's Pete Rourke, Gideon said. He helps out afternoons and weekends, lives in town with his mother. Pete was already at the horses' heads. Good trip? He asked, not particularly directing it at anyone. Road's rough, Gideon said. Better take a look at the left rear wheel tomorrow. I heard something on the creek crossing. Yes, sir. Pete's eyes slid to Evelyn with a quick curiosity that he immediately tried to cover with professional detachment. He was not entirely successful. Miss Hartwell, Gideon said, and the introduction seemed to be the entirety of it. Hello, Pete, Evelyn said. Pete went red from the collar to the hairline and became very interested in the horses. Gideon climbed down and started on the trunks again. Evelyn descended from the wagon and stood in the yard looking at the house. The cold was a different creature here than it had been in town. It had room to move, and it moved with intent. Inside's warmer, Gideon said, with what she was beginning to recognize as his version of consideration. The inside was, indeed, warmer. He'd left a fire banked before he left for the station, and the kitchen was comfortable, the main room serviceable. There was a settee that had seen better years, a table that was clearly the room's center of gravity, and bookshelves along the far wall that held, by her quick count, somewhere in the range of 80 volumes. She went directly to them. She couldn't help it. "They're not organized," he said from behind her. He was carrying the smaller trunk. "I've tried a few systems, and none of them stuck." "You have Middlemarch." She said it like a small accusation. "Twice. One's a backup in case the first one's damaged. George Eliot is not negotiable." Evelyn turned around. He was setting the trunk down by the far wall, and he was not looking at her, which was the only reason she allowed herself a moment to recalibrate, to let the books and the fire and the solid, purposeful construction of this room adjust, slightly, the image she'd been trying to force reality into fitting. The man in the room was the same man on the platform. Worn coat, rough hands, face that had taken weather without complaint for 3 decades. That hadn't changed, but the bookshelves were real. The Middlemarch backup copy was real. The fact that he'd banked the fire before he left, against her arrival, thinking ahead without mentioning it, was real. She didn't say any of that. She turned back to the shelves. "Where would you like my trunks?" she asked. "Back bedroom's yours. I'll be in the front." A pause. "The door has a bolt." "I appreciate that." "It's a matter of, I just want you to feel—" He stopped, cleared his throat. "The bolt works," he said. It was the first time he'd fumbled anything. Evelyn kept her expression entirely neutral. "Thank you, Gideon." He nodded and went back out for the second trunk. The first week was like learning a new language by immersion. You understood very little, you made embarrassing mistakes, and you went to bed each night with the pleasant exhaustion of someone who has used their brain all day in unfamiliar ways. Evelyn was not, and had never been, a woman who tolerated uselessness. She'd managed the Hartwell household accounts since she was 22. She'd been running a household school for her younger cousins until her aunt, in a fit of ambition, had hired a governess. She had opinions, systems, and a native instinct for organization that had always made her household situations run smoothly and her social situations somewhat complicated. She assessed the ranch's operation the way she would have assessed any household, with brisk, systematic attention. The results were interesting. On the positive side, the finances, which Gideon kept in a ledger of almost religious precision, were genuinely sound. He'd been operating the ranch at a modest profit for 3 years, growing it carefully. His cattle management, what she could observe of it in a week, reflected a knowledge that was both instinctive and analytical. He could look at a section of pasture and tell you how many head it could support in a dry summer. He understood when to sell and when to hold. He'd turned down an offer for 10 head the previous fall that his neighbor Briggs had taken, and by spring his cattle had been worth 30% more. "How did you know?" she asked the morning he explained this. They were at the kitchen table over coffee, which had become their functional headquarters for the running of the operation. Combination of things. Futures prices were soft, but the trend was a buyer's hesitation, not a real drop. Railroad line extension was coming through next spring, which would drop transport costs. And the ranches east of here had a disease problem last year. That herd was going to be smaller than expected, which meant prices would go back up. He looked at the ledger, not at her. It was a guess based on information. Might have been wrong. But you weren't. Not that time. What did you think when Briggs took the offer? Thought he might be right and I might be wrong. That's usually what I think when I'm making a decision that isn't certain. He finally looked up. Does that concern you? What? That you acknowledge uncertainty. Some women would rather a man sound certain, even if he isn't. Those women are enabling bad decisions, Evelyn said. If you were falsely certain, I'd be concerned. The fact that you're genuinely calibrated is reassuring. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was beginning to recognize. That slight recalibration, like a man adjusting his grip. All right, he said, and went back to the ledger. On the negative side of her assessment, the ranch's record-keeping, while financially precise, was scattered in every other category. Feed inventory was tracked in a separate system from livestock records, which were in a different book from weather notes, which Gideon kept on loose paper that he stuffed into a desk drawer and apparently retrieved by memory and faith. This is going to be a problem, she told him on the third day, holding up a fistful of the loose papers. Has been fine so far. It's fine until it isn't, and then it will be catastrophic. You have no system for cross-referencing conditions with outcomes. If you had a bad winter and lost cattle, could you go back and tell me which pastures were most affected and what the weather pattern was the 2 weeks before? He opened his mouth, closed it. Could you tell me how that compared to the previous bad winter? A pause. Not exactly. Then I'm building you a better system. He leaned against the kitchen door frame. You're welcome to. I'm not asking permission. I'm informing you of what's going to happen. Something in his face, not offense, but recognition, like she'd done something he'd expected and was slightly pleased to see confirmed. All right, he said, for the second time in 3 days. She spent the next 4 days redesigning his records. He watched, occasionally from a careful distance, the way a person watches a craftsman at unfamiliar work, not skeptically, but with the attention of someone learning something. On the 6th day, he sat down beside her at the table without being invited and said, "Show me how this connects to the pasture rotation." She showed him. He asked 3 questions that were sharp enough to make her rethink part of the system. She revised it. "Better," he said. "Yes," she agreed. They sat with the books between them, and it was not comfortable, exactly. They were still 2 people who were essentially strangers operating in close quarters with the daily weight of the arrangement between them. But it was functional. It was honest. And that, Evelyn was beginning to think, was a much better foundation than comfortable. The Briggs family came to dinner on the 8th day. Calvin Briggs was a broad, loud, well-intentioned man who shook Gideon's hand with both of his and told him 3 times in the first 5 minutes how glad he was to see him settling down. His wife Nora was small and compact with quick dark eyes and a manner that managed to be warm without being excessive. She brought the baby. The baby was 4 months old and expressed strong opinions about the visit in a carrying voice. "Evelyn," Nora said when they'd shaken hands. "That's a lovely name. My grandmother was Evelina, which isn't quite the same." "It's close enough," Evelyn said. "Is she always this opinionated?" She nodded toward the baby. "About everything, unfortunately. Gets it from Cal." Nora's mouth curved. "The lungs, anyway." They ate at the long table. Evelyn had made a roast that was, she privately felt, above serviceable and approaching inspired, though she wouldn't have said so, and Calvin talked about cattle and roads and territory politics, and Gideon spoke when he had something to add and was quiet when he didn't, which Evelyn recognized by now as his natural rhythm. "You'll need to come to the spring gathering," Calvin told Evelyn, helping himself to more roast. "Ranchers get together at the Whitmore place. Joseph Whitmore. He's the county commissioner. Enormous house. His wife Agnes does it every spring. Good time to meet folks." "I'd like that," Evelyn said. "Gideon doesn't go every year," Calvin said, with the comfortable directness of someone who'd known the man too long for tact. "I go when I have reason to," Gideon said. "He doesn't like Whitmore," Calvin told Evelyn, as though Gideon were not present. "I don't trust Whitmore," Gideon corrected, which is different. "Why?" Evelyn asked. "Because not liking someone is personal. Not trusting them is observational." He reached for the bread. "Whitmore's been pushing the county to rezone 3 sections of public grazing land. Looks like administrative tidying from the outside. Would actually benefit his own land holdings directly and cut off water access for 4 ranches, including Cal's." Calvin's expression shifted. "I've been watching that." "Watch it closer. He's going to move on it in the spring session." They talked about it for 20 minutes, the specifics of land law and water rights and territorial politics. And Evelyn listened and entered the conversation twice with precision, and was listened to both times, which she noticed, and which Gideon noticed her noticing. After dinner, when Nora was feeding the baby in the back room and Calvin was outside with Gideon talking horses, Evelyn cleaned up the kitchen and thought about the gathering in spring and what it would mean standing among strangers, introduced as Gideon Hale's wife. Nora came back in with the baby asleep on her shoulder and helped with the dishes without being asked. "He's a good man," Nora said quietly. Not with the fervor of persuasion, but with the plainness of someone stating something they'd tested long enough to be sure of. "I believe you," Evelyn said. "But?" "No but. I'm still learning what that means in practice. Nora dried a plate with the efficiency of a woman who had done so 10,000 times. "The learning part is longer than you think," she said, "and shorter than you're afraid it is. That's been my experience anyway." Evelyn didn't answer, but she kept turning it over later that night in the back bedroom with the bolt drawn and the fire low and the great Wyoming silence pressing against the walls. "The learning part is longer than you think, and shorter than you're afraid it is." She fell asleep before she could decide which of those to be more concerned about. By the third week, she had stopped thinking about Philadelphia every morning. This was not a dramatic shift. There was no moment of clarity, no decision made. It was simply that one morning she woke up thinking about the fence line inventory she wanted to complete before the ground froze. And she didn't have a single thought about Chestnut Street before noon. And when she noticed this, she noticed it the way you notice that a sound has stopped, with the faint surprise of an absence. The ranch in November was not a gentle place. The cold came off the mountains with authority, and the work had a relentlessness that Philadelphia living had never quite prepared her for. She helped where she could and learned fast. She had always been good at learning fast, and Gideon taught her things without condescension. That part she had not expected, the without condescension part. Most men, she told Nora, during one of Nora's visits while their husbands were in the eastern pasture, explain things to women in a particular way, a slightly simplified way, like they're not sure the full version will take. Cal does that sometimes, Nora admitted, less than he used to. Gideon doesn't. He explains something once at full complexity, and then he expects me to have understood it, and he moves on. If I haven't, I have to ask. Is that frustrating? Evelyn considered. It's the most respectful thing anyone has ever done for me intellectually, she said, which makes it slightly overwhelming. There were difficulties. She would not pretend otherwise, even to herself. The ranch had rhythms she didn't yet understand, and she sometimes made decisions based on Philadelphia logic that met Wyoming reality badly. She'd reorganized the storage shed by category, tools with tools, supplies with supplies, and discovered after 2 weeks that Gideon's original system had been based on frequency of need, which meant his most used items were all now at the back of their respective categories. And her logical system was making his mornings 12 minutes longer every day. "Why didn't you tell me?" she demanded when this finally surfaced. "I figured you'd notice." "How was I supposed to notice that I'd inconvenienced you if you didn't tell me you were inconvenienced?" He looked at her with the expression of a man who had not considered this precise angle. "Fair point," he said. "I need you to tell me when I've done something that makes your work harder. I can't fix problems I don't know exist. All right? That means you have to actually tell me, not wait." "I understand that. Do you promise?" He raised an eyebrow. No one, his expression said, had asked him to promise something in quite this way for a long time. "Yes," he said. "I promise." She reorganized the shed by frequency of need within categories, which was a better system than either of the previous two, and which Gideon said nothing about except to go to the right place immediately the next morning, which was all the acknowledgement she required. Small exchanges, small negotiations, the daily accumulation of two people learning to occupy the same life without trampling each other's edges. She wrote to Ruth Albright on a Sunday in late November, sitting at the kitchen table with the afternoon light coming through the window at that particular western angle that turned ordinary rooms briefly beautiful. "Ruth," the short version. "I'm still here, and I'm not entirely sure what that means yet, but I'm here. He's not what I expected. I knew that from the first moment on the platform. What I didn't expect was that the difference would be complicated. I expected to be disappointed. I was not prepared to be impressed in ways I hadn't imagined to look for." He reads Eliot. He keeps a backup copy in case the first one is damaged. He taught himself cattle futures from a book he ordered from Denver, and has used it to make better decisions than ranchers who've been doing this their whole lives. He fixed his own stove. He doesn't explain things simply to me. He's also rough-edged in ways that are sometimes genuinely difficult. He doesn't signal his feelings. He doesn't soften news. Last week he told me very plainly that he'd been worried my roast would be dry, and then seemed genuinely confused that this was not the compliment he'd intended. I corrected his record-keeping system. He let me. He then improved my improvement. "I don't know what to tell you, Ruth. I married a man's letters, and the man standing behind the letters is larger and stranger than I expected. But I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it might be the most interesting thing that's happened to me." Tell me about Philadelphia. Tell me something small and familiar. I miss the smell of the bakery on Chestnut Street. Evelyn. She folded the letter and set it with the ones going to town on Monday. Then she sat for another minute in the western light and listened to the sound of Gideon outside, moving around the barn with that steady, purposeful rhythm that had become, she realized, one of the sounds of her days. Outside, the mountains were turning purple against the darkening sky. The cold was building toward what she was learning to recognize as a serious cold. Not the ordinary bite, but something more intentional, the kind that came with clouds that stacked on the western horizon like a warning. She watched the clouds and thought about the fence line inventory she still hadn't finished. She didn't know, watching those clouds, what they would eventually require of her. She would learn. The clouds Evelyn had watched, stacking on the western horizon, delivered their promise overnight, and she woke to 6 inches of snow and the sound of Gideon already outside before dawn, moving through it with a kind of methodical patience that she was beginning to understand was simply how he moved through everything, obstacles included. She dressed quickly, built the kitchen fire back up, and had coffee on by the time he came in stamping snow off his boots at the door. His coat was crusted white across the shoulders. His face was red from the cold, and he looked simultaneously miserable and completely unbothered by being miserable, which was a combination she'd been observing in him for 3 weeks now and still couldn't quite decide how to feel about. "Cattle are fine," he said before she asked. "Barn's holding heat. I need to check the east fence line this afternoon. That section was weak before the snow." "I'll come." He stopped pulling off his coat and looked at her. "You've been on the east section once," he said. "Then this will be the second time." He looked at her for another moment. Not doubtfully, exactly. More like a man running a quick calculation. "Dress for worse than it looks," he said. "It always looks better than it is." That was how it started. Her going out with him. It hadn't been planned. Neither of them had discussed whether ranch work was something she would participate in or observe or manage from the kitchen. It had simply happened, organically, the way most things between them happened, not with negotiation, but with incremental fact. The east fence line took 3 hours. The snow was ankle-deep in the open and knee-deep in the draws, and 2 posts had shifted badly enough to need resetting, which involved cold hands and iron-hard ground, and a vocabulary from Gideon that was, she noted, fairly extensive for a man of otherwise measured speech. She held the post while he drove it. She was not very strong compared to him, but she was steady, and steady was what the work needed. "You can let go," he said when it was set. She stepped back. Her hands were numb inside her gloves. "You should have brought heavier gloves," he said, and it was not scolding, just observation. "I didn't know I owned heavier gloves." "Top shelf of the storage room, left side near the back. There's a pair of lined ones, too big for you, but you can use 2 pairs of regular ones inside them." She filed this away. He knew exactly where every functional thing on this ranch was, even after her reorganization of the storage shed, which she suspected he'd quietly remapped in his own mental inventory. On the way back, with the light going flat and thin the way it did in December afternoons, he said without preamble, "You're not what I expected either." She glanced at him. He was watching the ground ahead, reading the snow the way he read everything, with that focused, particular attention. "What did you expect?" she asked. "Someone more cautious about the work. Is that a compliment?" "Observation." "You give a lot of those." "Compliments?" "Observations dressed as compliments." He was quiet for a step or two. "I suppose I do," he admitted. "For the record," she said, "the east fence line was the hardest I've worked in my life, and my hands feel like 2 wooden objects attached to my wrists, and I'd do it again tomorrow." He looked at her then, just briefly. But something in his face did something she couldn't name. Not softening exactly, more like a door that had been closed opening a 1/4 inch and the light from inside catching before it was pulled back to where it was. "All right," he said. They walked the rest of the way back in the comfortable silence that Evelyn was only now realizing was something different from the defensive silence of those first hours on the wagon. This silence didn't need filling. It was 2 people tired in the same direction, moving toward the same fire. December deepened around them, and the ranch settled into its winter rhythms. She learned them by immersion, the feeding schedule, the twice-daily checks, the way certain cattle needed watching more than others. He knew them individually, which she had not expected, and she'd asked him once how he kept them distinct in his head, and he'd said flatly, "You spend enough time with anything, you learn its particular way of being difficult." She'd written that down later in the margin of the records book, because it seemed to apply to considerably more than cattle. The record system she'd built became the daily instrument of the ranch's management, and Gideon had, without announcement, begun using it with a fluency that told her he'd studied it when she wasn't watching. He started adding weather observations in the margin column she'd designated for external conditions. Then he started cross-referencing them with the cattle health notes. Then he came to her one morning with the ledger open and said, "Look at this," and showed her a pattern she hadn't seen, a correlation between the eastern pasture's drainage and a recurring respiratory issue in the cattle that wintered there. "That pasture holds water after heavy snow," he said, tracing the margin notes. "I knew that, but I didn't have a way to see how much it mattered. Your system makes it visible." Evelyn looked at the pattern. It was clear, once you could see it. "Move them earlier next fall," she said, "before the first significant snowfall." "That's what I think too." "What did you lose to respiratory issues last winter?" 3 head. She did the math against the ledger prices. "Moving them earlier costs you maybe 3 weeks of eastern grazing. Saves you more than that in losses." "Yes. Then it's simple. Most things are, once you can see the shape of them." He closed the ledger. "The hard part is getting to where you can see the shape." She looked at him across the table. He was already moving on to the next thing, picking up the feed inventory, running his thumb down the column, entirely unaware, apparently, of having said something that was going to stay with her for a long time. "The hard part is getting to where you can see the shape." She went back to her own work and turned it over quietly in her mind. It was during that same week that she had her first real confrontation with the question of what the other ranchers thought of Gideon Hale's arrangements. It came through Pete Rourke, which she hadn't anticipated. Pete had been warming to her slowly all through December, from his initial condition of chronic red-faced flight to a state of functional conversation, provided she did not ask him anything too directly personal or make sudden moves. He was bright underneath the shyness, with a knack for machinery that Gideon openly relied on, and she'd been teaching him basic accounting in exchange for him teaching her how to read a horse's health by its posture and eye, a trade they'd both found more useful than expected. He came in one afternoon while Gideon was out checking the north pasture fence, and he was carrying the kind of silence that meant something had happened. "Pete," she said. "Ma'am." "Sit down. What's wrong?" He sat. He turned his hat in his hands twice. "I was in town this morning, picking up that part for the harness." "Yes. I was in Halston's, the feed store, and there were some men in there, ranchers. I know who they are. Doyle Mercer and his brother Wade." He paused. "They were talking about Mr. Hale." Evelyn set down her pen. "What were they saying?" Pete looked at his hat. "That he'd gone soft. That having a wife from back east who keeps his books and tells him how to run his own operation was—" He stopped. "Pete, they said it wasn't natural, a woman running the money on a working ranch. Said Mr. Hale had clearly lost his nerve if he needed a Philadelphia schoolteacher to manage things." He finally looked up. His freckled face was tight with the particular anger of a young person who has heard something unjust and doesn't have the power to do anything about it yet. "I didn't say anything. I don't know if I should have." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She was aware of the precise temperature of her own anger, measuring it the way you measured a fire, how much heat there was and where it was coming from. "You did the right thing by not engaging," she said. "Those men aren't worth your job security." Does Mr. Hale know people are saying things like that?" "Almost certainly." Pete absorbed this. "He doesn't seem to care." "No," she agreed. "He doesn't." She picked up her pen again, which is one of the more interesting things about him. After Pete left, she sat with it for a while. The truth was, it had not surprised her. She'd known with abstract certainty that a woman keeping accounts and writing fence lines and having opinions at the dinner table with neighboring ranchers was going to produce this kind of talk. She'd known it intellectually. It landed differently in the actual specific form of Doyle Mercer at a feed store saying Gideon had gone soft. She was still sitting with it when Gideon came back in from the north fence, smelling of cold and horses, and poured himself coffee at the stove. "Doyle Mercer and his brother were talking about you at Halston's this morning," she said. Pete heard it. Gideon turned around with his coffee cup. What did they say? She told him. She watched his face while she did it and observed. No flinch, no flush of anger, nothing that looked like hurt. Just a kind of still listening, the way he listened to weather. Doyle Mercer lost 40 head last winter, he said when she'd finished. I know, it's in the records. You made a note of it because of the market effect. He lost them because he runs his operation on instinct and stubbornness and refuses to keep records or change what isn't working. His father ran it the same way. He sipped his coffee. A man like that is going to call anyone who does things differently soft. It's not personal. It's self-defense. Does it bother you at all? Not Mercer specifically. Just any of it. He thought about this honestly, which she appreciated. It did once. When I first started running things differently from my father's methods, ran into the same kind of talk. He sat down across from her. I decided it bothered me less than losing cattle I could have saved. That's a reasonable calculus. I thought so. He set down the cup. Does it bother you? She met his eyes. A little? Not because I care about Mercer's opinion, because it means people are thinking about my presence here as something to evaluate. Whether I belong, whether I'm changing things in ways they find threatening. You are changing things. I know. And you belong. He said it without particular emphasis, like reading a line from the ledger, a fact that had been noted and verified and didn't need arguing. Evelyn felt something shift, quietly, behind her sternum. Thank you, she said. He nodded and went back to his coffee. It wasn't the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to her. It was considerably better. The partnership, because that was the right word for it, she'd decided, even before the word marriage fit properly, had its difficult passages too, and she would not pretend otherwise. They were both stubborn. They both had strong ideas. The difference was that their stubbornness tended to operate on different frequencies, which meant they could sometimes be simultaneously wrong in different directions without canceling each other out. In early January, there was an argument about the cattle rotation schedule that became, without either of them intending it, an argument about considerably more. She thought the south pasture could handle another 3 weeks of use before rotation. He was certain it couldn't. They were standing in the cold near the barn, and the disagreement had been going on long enough that their breath was making small clouds, and Pete had made himself very busy in the barn and very invisible. I've been watching this pasture for 8 years, Gideon said. His voice had gone flat in the way she'd learned meant he'd made a decision and was protecting it. And I've been analyzing the grass density and root depth for the past 6 weeks from your own notes, she said. Your observation is experiential. My assessment is systematic. They should inform each other, not compete. My observation is that the pasture is done. Your observation was made last Thursday. It's had 5 days of recovery since then with lighter traffic. 5 days is not recovery. It's partial recovery, which is different from none. She was holding her ground, and she knew she was holding it from stubbornness as much as certainty, and that was not entirely to her credit. I'm not saying I'm right. I'm saying the data supports more time. The data, he said, doesn't smell the grass or feel the freeze depth. That stopped her. He was right about that. The data she'd built was good. It was genuinely good, and he'd said so. But she'd been treating it as superior to his observation when the honest answer was that it was complementary. Different tools for a different part of the same picture. Rotate in 10 days, she said. Not 3 weeks. 10 days. That's a compromise position that takes both into account. He looked at her. 10 days, he said. Unless you see something in the field that makes 5 days the better call, in which case, tell me, and I'll adjust the records. A pause. The flat December cold around them, the cattle moving in the middle distance. All right, he said, 10 days. They walked back to the house with a few feet of air between them and the particular silence of two people who'd had a real disagreement and resolved it badly enough to have done it honestly, but well enough not to have damaged anything permanent. She made dinner. He fixed a hinge on the kitchen door that had been loose for 2 weeks. Neither of them mentioned it again. That was another thing she was learning. How to be angry with someone and not require the anger to become a verdict. Her mother handled disagreements by dissolving them with politeness until they became something no one could find anymore. She'd grown up thinking that was sophistication. She was learning it was just a different kind of damage. 10 days later, Gideon came in from the south pasture and said, You were right about the 10 days. I'm rotating this week. I know, she said, and poured him coffee. He looked at her with something that might, in a certain light, have been called amusement. "You're not going to say anything else?" "What would I say?" "You assessed it, you confirmed the call. I don't need the satisfaction of being told I was right." "Most people do." "I need the satisfaction of the ranch running well. Those are different things." She pushed the coffee toward him. "Though I appreciate you telling me." He picked up the coffee. "You're strange, Miss Hartwell," he said. And she had noticed actually for about a week, that he'd been stopping just before Mrs. Hale, like he was auditioning the word in his head and hadn't decided whether to use it yet. "So I've been told," she said. By February, the strangest thing had happened. She had stopped being afraid. Not afraid of the work. She'd stopped being afraid of that in the first 2 weeks. Not afraid of the winter, which was genuinely brutal, and had settled in with the kind of serious intention that made Philadelphia winters feel like suggestions. What she'd stopped being afraid of was the question she'd been carrying since that first wagon ride from Clearwater Junction, whether she'd made an irreparable mistake, whether the man she'd married in letters was a fiction, and the real Gideon Hale was someone she'd never be able to reach. She hadn't resolved that question so much as she'd stopped needing to. The answer had been assembling itself in pieces all along, in the way he'd banked the fire before leaving for the station, in the backup copy of Middlemarch, in the East Fence Line, and the cattle records, and the 10-day compromise, and the single flat sentence "you belong." And sometime in February, she'd looked up from the records book and realized the question had just quietly left the room. What was in the room instead was harder to name. Not love, exactly. Not yet. But something with the same structural properties. Something load-bearing, something you could put weight on and not have it shift. She wrote to Ruth again on a Sunday night in February, with the fire low and the wind coming hard off the mountains. "Ruth, I am going to tell you something, and I need you not to make it mean more than I'm saying. I trust him. Not just in the practical sense, though, that too. I trust his judgment, his honesty, his management of this ranch, and his management of himself. But I mean something more specific than that. I trust that when he tells me something, he's telling me the true version, even when the true version is inconvenient. I trust that when he disagrees with me, it's because he actually disagrees and not because he's performing authority. I trust that his respect for my intelligence is real and not a courtesy he extends until it becomes inconvenient. I didn't know I'd been waiting to trust someone until I found that I already did. The ranch is doing well. We had a hard February so far, but the cattle numbers are holding. He said last week, without looking up from the ledger, that this was going to be the best operating year in the ranch's history, and he said it the way he says things he considers settled fact. I told him I'd calculated the same thing. He said, "I know," and kept reading. "I think I'm going to be all right, Ruth. I think I might be considerably better than all right. Evelyn." She sealed the letter and added it to the pile. Outside, the wind worked at the corners of the house with its usual February determination. The ranch held. Inside, the fire settled lower in the grate, and from the front bedroom she could hear the particular silence of Gideon Hale sleeping. A sound that was not really a sound at all, just the absence of the subtle alertness he carried when he was awake. She had noticed somewhere along the way that the most honest signal of how someone occupied a space was what happened when they stopped trying. In sleep, in an unguarded moment, in the middle of a hard day when performance was too costly and only the real thing remained. Gideon Hale, in every unguarded moment she had witnessed, was exactly what the letters had promised. She had just needed to learn how to see it. She turned down the lamp and went to bed, and for the first time since Clearwater Junction, she did not bolt the door. The spring gathering at the Whitmore place happened on the first Saturday of April, when the snow had pulled back from the lower elevations and the roads were passable in a spirit of cautious optimism that Wyoming weather did not always honor. Agnes Whitmore's house was the largest in Powder River County, built in a style that wanted very badly to be Eastern, and had almost gotten there. The way a student who has studied a language from books almost sounds like a native speaker, but not quite. There were curtains with fringe. There was a parlor with furniture that no one used for sitting. There was Agnes herself, a tall woman with excellent posture and the particular manner of someone who had decided a long time ago that graciousness was a performance worth giving at full commitment. "Mrs. Hale," Agnes said, taking Evelyn's hands with real warmth, which surprised her. "I've been so eager to meet you. Gideon has been a fixture of this county for a decade and never once brought anyone to anything. I can believe that, Evelyn said. Behind her, she heard Gideon make a small sound that was not quite a cough. The gathering was perhaps 40 people in total. Ranchers and their wives, a few men from town, the county commissioner himself moving through the room with the practiced ease of a man who understood social occasions as operational territory. Joseph Whitmore was younger than she'd imagined from Gideon's descriptions, somewhere in his mid-40s, well-dressed in a way that felt deliberate rather than habitual. He had a good handshake and excellent eye contact, and the kind of smile that arrived at exactly the right moment, every time, which Evelyn found more unsettling than an imperfect one. "Mrs. Hale." He held her hand a half-second longer than necessary. "Your husband is one of the sharpest operators in this county. I hope you know that." "I'm beginning to," she said pleasantly. "We hear you've been modernizing his record-keeping, getting the place organized." The way he said it was not unkind, but there was something in the inflection, modernizing, organized, that placed the words in a category adjacent to charming hobby. Evelyn had heard that inflection before. She'd heard it all her life, in parlors and at dinner tables, applied to women's contributions to men's work. "I've been building an integrated management system," she said, cross-referencing weather patterns with cattle health outcomes and pasture rotation. "We identified a drainage issue in the east section that was costing us 3 head a winter. Fixed it. The operating margins this year are the best in the ranch's history." A pause. Whitmore's smile recalibrated itself by about 3 degrees. "Is that right? The numbers are in the ledger, if you'd like to review them." Beside her, Gideon said nothing, but she felt rather than saw the slight shift in his posture, something that in another man might have been a smile, contained. Whitmore moved on after another moment, smoothly, the way water moves around a stone. Evelyn watched him go. "That was well done," Gideon said quietly. "I wasn't performing." "I know, that's why it was well done." She turned and looked at him. He was watching Whitmore's path through the room with that observational calm that she'd come to read as its own kind of alertness. "He's going to move on the rezoning," she said. "Soon. Spring session, 6 weeks. Cal and Nora need to be ready. I've been talking to Cal, and to 3 other ranchers who'd be affected." He paused. "I was going to mention it tonight. There are 4 of them here." She looked around the room with new attention, recalculating. "You've been organizing opposition." "I've been having conversations." "That's the same thing." "Marginally." She looked at him. He was still watching the room, calm as weather. "How long have you been doing this without telling me?" she asked. "About 3 weeks." "Why didn't you say something?" He glanced at her. "I wasn't sure it would go anywhere. Didn't want to put it in the ledger until there was something worth recording." It was a reasonable answer. It was also, she recognized, the place where his instinct towards self-containment bumped up against her need for information. The same friction that had produced the storage shed argument and the pasture rotation disagreement. The difference was that she understood it better now. It wasn't secrecy. It was the habit of a man who had spent a decade making decisions alone and had not yet fully recalibrated for partnership. "Tell me earlier next time," she said, "even if it's not certain." "All right. I might have something useful to add. That's why I'm telling you now." She considered this. "Fair enough," she said. And they moved further into the room to meet the ranchers Gideon had been quietly talking to for 3 weeks, and the evening became something more interesting than a social occasion. The Whitmore situation resolved itself over the following weeks with the methodical grind of territorial politics, which was to say, it was not clean or satisfying, but it worked. Gideon's coalition of 4 ranchers became 7 when 2 more quietly joined after seeing the rezoning proposal in writing. Evelyn drafted the formal objection because she was the one among them who wrote with the precision required for legal language, and she did it at the kitchen table over 3 evenings, while Gideon read over her shoulder and said that and that at 2 sentences that needed strengthening, and she strengthened them. "You should have been a lawyer," he said on the 3rd evening. "Women don't become lawyers." "They should." She looked up at him. He said it the way he said most things, plainly, without ceremony, as though it were simply a fact that needed stating. "You say things like that," she said, "and then you say nothing for 2 hours. And I can't tell if you're the most progressive man I've ever met, or if you just periodically have these thoughts and don't consider them remarkable. Both probably, he said. Go back to the third paragraph. The jurisdiction clause is weak. She went back to the third paragraph. The objection was filed in mid-April. The spring session voted on the rezoning in early May. The proposal failed by a margin of 4 votes in the territorial legislature, which was not a comfortable margin, but was sufficient. Calvin Briggs came out to the ranch the day the result was known and shook Gideon's hand for a long time and said something to him quietly that Evelyn didn't catch. Whatever it was, Gideon's face did the thing, that quarter-inch opening, and then closed again. Good work on that document, Cal told Evelyn. Agnes Whitmore is apparently furious, which I consider an additional benefit. Tell Nora I'll bring the records analysis over next week, Evelyn said. I want to show her the water access projections for the north section. If Joseph tries this again, we should have the documentation ready before he files. Cal looked at her, then at Gideon, with the expression of a man who was revising an estimate he'd made some time ago. Right, he said. I'll tell her. After he left, Gideon stood on the porch for a moment before coming back inside. He didn't say anything about it. He didn't need to. She'd learned to read his silences the way she'd learned to read the weather. Not perfectly, but well enough. Spring became the best working season the ranch had seen. The cattle figures came in above projection. 2 of the replacement heifers Gideon had bought the previous fall turned out to be exceptional, a fact he mentioned with the studied understatement of a man pleased with a gamble that paid, though he would not have called it a gamble, having calculated the odds carefully before buying them. They hired a second part-time hand, a taciturn man named Samuel, who was 50 years old and knew horses the way Gideon knew cattle, which meant they barely needed to talk about anything. The ranch found its stride. And somewhere inside that stride, without either of them announcing it or making it a moment, their marriage found something too. It was not dramatic. There was no particular evening where everything shifted. No declaration at sunset, no sudden revelation. It was more like the drainage fix in the East pasture. You changed one variable, and then the problem that had been there quietly for months resolved itself, and you noted it in the records and moved on. She started sleeping with the bedroom door open. He started making 2 cups of coffee in the morning without asking. Small things. The kind of things that are not small. Midsummer, he brought her a book from town, not Middlemarch, which she already had, but a volume of essays on land economics by a writer out of Denver who was apparently causing controversy in agricultural circles by arguing for more systematic management of grazing land. He set it on the kitchen table without ceremony and said, "Thought you'd have opinions about Chapter 4. She read Chapter 4 that night. In the morning, over coffee, she had 6 opinions about Chapter 4. He had 4. 2 of them disagreed with each other's positions. The disagreement lasted through breakfast and was still going in the background when Pete arrived for the day's work and went quietly out to the barn to avoid being in it. "You're wrong about the Commons argument," she told Gideon. "I'm not wrong. I'm skeptical. Those are different. Your skepticism is based on a reading of the evidence that cherry-picks the failure cases. My skepticism is based on having watched how people behave when they think resources are shared. They don't conserve. They take. Some do. Not all. The essay documents 3 counterexamples in the Southwest. 3. It's a new field. 3 documented examples is how it starts." He leaned back in his chair. He had the look of a man who had just realized he might be wrong and was conducting an internal review before admitting it. She'd learned to recognize this look. It usually took between 30 seconds and 2 minutes. "I'll reread Chapter 4, he said. "I'll reread your objection," she said. This was, she had come to understand, as close to tenderness as either of them naturally got at a table with a book between them. It was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. The summer passed hard and bright and productive. Then August arrived, and with it the first signs of the fall that would come. September brought rain when it should have been dry and dry when it should have rained, the erratic kind of autumn that old-timers in the county watched with the particular attention of people who had seen what came after. Samuel, the second hand, said one afternoon in mid-September while fixing harness leather on the porch, "Gonna be a hard one." He didn't specify what. He didn't need to. The 3 of them looked at the sky without disagreement. Gideon started winterizing in September instead of October. He brought the cattle in from the North Range 2 weeks early. He ordered extra feed through Cal's Connection in Sheridan, which cost more than the standard supplier but arrived more reliably. He went over the barn roof 3 times and found 2 weak sections he replaced with new timber. Evelyn updated the emergency protocols she'd added to the record system in the spring, a section Gideon had looked at when she'd built it and said nothing about, which she'd interpreted as neither approval nor objection, but which she now understood, knowing him better, had actually been a quiet kind of gratitude. "If we lose the main road for more than a week," she said one evening in October, spreading the records book on the table, "we have enough feed for 90 days, enough provisions for 60. The creek access from the east pasture stays unfrozen down to about 15 below, based on last year's notes." He was looking at the same page. "The creek ice is faster on the north bank. I've seen it go at 10 below when the wind's off the mountain." She made a note. "I'll adjust the estimate. 12 days without the road would be the stress point. After that, we'd need to send someone to town regardless of conditions. Pete could make it on horseback faster than the wagon. Pete could make it on horseback in most things." He traced the feed inventory column with one finger. "We're good." "We're good," she agreed. She did not know, making that calm assessment with the lamplight steady and the October wind reasonable outside, that she was weeks away from being the reason the plan nearly fell apart. November came in cold, but not yet serious. The first real snow fell on the 5th, a foot overnight, and the ranch moved through it with the preparedness of people who had not been surprised. The second snow came on the 12th, another 8 inches, and the temperature settled below freezing and stayed there. It was during the brief plateau between the second and third storms that Evelyn made her decision about the fence line. The east section, the same line she'd first walked with Gideon in that early November snowfall a year ago, had a 3-mile stretch along the creek that she'd been watching in the records. Last winter's ice damage had been repaired in the spring, but the repairs were new timber spliced into old posts, and new timber and old post holes had a tendency to shift in the first hard freeze. She'd noted this in the margin. Gideon had agreed it needed checking before the serious winter set in. He had planned to do it that Thursday. Wednesday night, Pete's mother sent word from town that she'd taken ill, and Gideon sent Pete to go be with her first thing in the morning, which was the right call and not a thing either of them second-guessed for a moment. Samuel's knee had been bad since the second snowfall, an old injury that cold compressed into real limitation, and Gideon had him on barn duty only, no riding. Thursday morning, Gideon came in from the early feeding and said, "I'll check the east line tomorrow. Weather's holding." "The temperature's dropping tonight," Evelyn said. She had been watching the western sky for 2 days with the attention she'd developed over a year of learning to read Wyoming's particular vocabulary. "If the creek ices before we check those posts, we won't be able to assess the base properly until spring. It'll hold another day. Maybe." She looked at the sky through the kitchen window. "I can do it this morning. I know the line. I've walked it twice." He looked at her. "Evelyn, I know the terrain. I know what to look for. You've shown me 3 times how to assess post stability in frozen ground." She turned from the window. "It's 4 miles out and back. The weather is currently fine, and I'll be back before the afternoon light goes. You need to be here for the cattle. 3 of the heifers are close to their time, and you said yesterday you didn't want to leave them." He was quiet for a moment with the quality of silence that meant he was calculating, not resisting. "Take the gray," he said finally. "She's steadier than the roan in bad footing." "I know." "Take the saddlebag with the emergency kit. The one on the left side of the tack room, not the right. The right one needs restocking." "I know that too." He looked at her for another moment. Something in his face that she couldn't quite name. Not worry exactly. More like a man looking at something he valued and measuring the distance between it and the nearest edge. "I'll be back by 3, she said. "If you're not," he said, "I'm coming out. I'll be back by 3. She left at 8:30 on a morning that was cold and clear and still, the kind of day that Wyoming sometimes offered in November as a kind of temporary clemency before the real business began. The gray moved well under her, and Evelyn rode with the focused pleasure of someone who had, over a year, become genuinely comfortable on horseback. Not elegant, not natural-born, but competent and confident in a way that had been earned mile by mile. The east fence line came into view 2 miles out, running along the higher bank of Heron Creek. She worked along it methodically from the north end, checking each post with the technique Gideon had shown her, Test for lateral stability, check the ground contact at the base, look for splitting in the wood where freeze-thaw had worked the grain. She found 2 posts that needed noting and one that genuinely needed replacing before the next hard freeze, and she recorded all 3 in the small notebook she'd taken to carrying in her coat pocket. She was 3/4 of the way along the line, maybe 1.25 miles from the ranch road, when she noticed the creek. The ice had come in faster than she'd expected. The surface that had been open water and slush 2 days ago was now covered, the North Bank shore frozen solid. What she was looking at was not solid ice, she knew the difference, had learned it, but it had the opacity and the particular matte color of ice that was 3 or 4 inches thick, the kind that looked substantial. The last 3 fence posts ran along a small spit of land that curved out toward the creek bank, the ground low and wet in spring, currently frozen. The most efficient path to reach them was across a short section of the creek's lower bend where it ran shallow and usually froze hard first. She should have gone around. She knew, even as she guided the gray toward the bank, that she should go around. The extra 1/4 mile. The safe ground. That was the correct decision, and she was making a different one, and she knew why she was making it. She wanted to be done and back by 3, and she had a specific, irrational determination to prove the accuracy of her own timeline, and those were bad reasons for anything. The gray hesitated at the bank. That was the first clear signal, and she overrode it with her heels, which was a mistake the horse's instincts had been right about. They made it 8 feet onto the ice. The sound was not what she expected. It was not a crack, but a kind of deep, soft giving, like a large book falling flat. And then the gray was breaking through and lurching, and Evelyn had exactly enough time to kick free of the stirrups before the horse found its footing on the creek bottom and scrambled up the far bank in a panicked surge that left her behind. The water was not deep, 3 feet, maybe less, but it was mountain snowmelt fed, and in November it was cold in a way that was not a temperature but a physical force, and it hit her like all the air had been removed from the world at once. She got her feet under her and got herself out of the creek. That part was adrenaline and muscle memory and the particular clarity of a mind that knows it is in real trouble. She got out. She stood on the bank, soaked to the hip, and watched the gray standing 20 feet away on solid ground, reins trailing, sides heaving, looking at her with the expression of an animal that had done what it could and was now prepared to be apologetic about it. She took stock. Her lower body was soaked entirely. Her coat was wet to the waist. The temperature on the bank was, at her best estimate, somewhere around 8 degrees. The wind that had been absent all morning was beginning. She could feel it in the trees along the creek, that first low speaking that came before the real thing arrived. She was 1.25 miles from the ranch road. Her hands were shaking, not from cold yet, from the shock of the water, but the cold was coming fast. She could feel it moving up through her wet clothing with a terrible efficiency, like something with intent. She needed to get to the horse. She walked toward the gray with every bit of calm steadiness she could manufacture, talking low and even the way Gideon had taught her, because a spooked horse on a frozen bank was a second disaster she could not afford. The gray let her approach, let her gather the reins. She got her foot to the stirrup, and her leg would not cooperate properly, the cold already working on the muscles, and it took her 3 attempts to mount. She turned toward the ranch road and urged the gray into a fast walk, because a fast walk was the most the frozen ground could safely support, and because the internal voice that had been trained by a year of Wyoming practicality was telling her with increasing urgency that fast was not the problem she needed to solve. Warm was the problem she needed to solve, and fast was only useful insofar as it got her to warm. The wind arrived properly about 10 minutes into the ride home. It came off the mountains the way Gideon had described it the previous winter, not building, but arriving, as though it had been waiting just over the ridge and had finally been let through the door. It hit her wet clothing with a cold that stopped being a sensation and started being a condition. She was 1 mile from the ranch road when she understood she was in serious trouble. Her hands had stopped feeling the reins. She could see them holding the leather, but the information was visual, not physical. Her legs from the knee down were somewhere outside the normal range of sensation, present but abstracted, the way a limb feels when circulation is cut off. Except this was not a limb falling asleep. This was cold doing a more permanent kind of work. She kept riding. She was not going to make 3 o'clock. The gray stumbled on a patch of hidden ice beneath the snow and recovered, But the lurch cost Evelyn her grip on the saddle horn, and she grabbed for it again with hands that could not close properly, and found herself leaning at an angle that was wrong, correcting with her core, which worked, but the effort cost her something she couldn't afford to keep spending. She thought about Gideon saying, "I'm coming out," if she wasn't back by 3. She thought about the distance between 3 o'clock and whatever time it currently was. She thought about the creek, about the sound of the ice going, about the gray's instinct at the bank that she had overridden with her heels, because she'd wanted to finish her task and be back on time and prove something to herself about her competence. The thought arrived with a lucidity that the cold had not yet touched. I did this. I made this choice. I overrode the horse, and I went onto the ice anyway, and now I am a mile from shelter, and my hands don't work and the wind is getting worse. It was not a comfortable thought, but it was a clear one, and clear was what she needed. She stayed on the horse. The ranch road was ahead. She knew it was ahead, and she rode toward where she knew it was, with her eyes fixed on the middle distance, and her useless hands on the reins and the gray moving beneath her with the reliable, steady patience of an animal that had, despite everything, decided to get this done. She did not make it to the ranch road. What she made it to was the junction between the creek path and the field that ran behind the barn's east side, and that was where the cold finished its work on her legs and she came off the horse. Not dramatically. She simply stopped being able to stay on, and she was on the ground, and the gray was standing beside her, reins dragging, and the wind was coming off the mountain with a sound like torn cloth. She got herself to the base of a large cottonwood, and she sat against it, which was the wrong thing to do. She knew it was the wrong thing. You didn't stop moving. You didn't sit. But her legs were not in a state to argue with, and the cottonwood gave her the wind protection of its solid trunk between her and the mountain's direction. The sky above the ridge was the color of old pewter. Not afternoon light. Earlier than she'd thought she'd been, or later. The cold had a way of collapsing time. She thought about the record system, about Chapter 4 of the Land Economics book, and whether she'd been right about the Commons argument, about the east fence line, and the 3 posts she'd noted, and the one that needed replacing before the first hard freeze. She thought, Gideon, not as a plea, just as a fact. The way she'd come to think of him over a year, as something solid in the architecture of her days, something load-bearing. The wind pushed at the cottonwood trunk and didn't get through, and Evelyn Hartwell pulled her wet coat tighter around herself with hands she couldn't feel, and she waited, and the cold came on in steady earnest as the pewter sky began, at its edges, to go dark. The gray came back alone. That was the thing Gideon would remember later, in the specific way you remember the moment before everything changed. Not the moment itself, but the one just before it, when the world was still the shape it had been. He was in the barn checking the heifers, the third one showing signs that her time was close, and he heard hooves in the yard with a rhythm that was wrong. Not the rhythm of a ridden horse, the particular loose, anxious canter of an animal that had lost its person. He was out of the barn before he'd finished the thought. The gray was standing in the yard with her reins trailing and her sides still heaving, and a look in her eye that horses get when they've been through something. Not panic anymore, past panic, into the flat residue of it. Her right foreleg had a cut above the knee, not deep, from the ice. Her lower legs were wet. Creek water. Gideon stood in the yard for approximately 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, he did the calculation that he always did. Every variable he knew, every piece of information available, assembled and weighed with the same precision he applied to cattle futures and weather patterns and everything else that mattered. Evelyn had left at 8:30. It was now 2:30. She'd been on the east fence line, which ran along Heron Creek. The gray's legs were wet from creek water. The temperature had dropped 4 degrees in the last 2 hours, and the wind off the mountain had come in hard about an hour ago. 1 mile of east fence line ran along a section of Heron Creek, where the north bank shallowed and sometimes froze fast in the first hard cold. He went back into the barn and had the roan saddled in under 4 minutes. He took the saddlebag from the left side of the tack room, his emergency kit, the one he told her to take, the one he now registered she had not taken because it was still on its hook, and he strapped it across the roan's back. He took the heavy blanket from the cedar chest in the tack room. He took the rope coil from the wall. He stopped at the barn door for 1 second and looked at the sky. The western edge was the color of a bruise. The wind was already making the cottonwoods along the creek line move in that full-body way that meant it was not gusting but sustained. Temperature was falling. would fall faster after dark. He rode out of the yard at a pace the ground could handle and no slower. Samuel came out of the equipment shed at the sound of hooves and took one look at Gideon's face and said, "I'll watch the heifers." Gideon didn't answer. He was already past the fence line. He rode the East Creek path because that was where she'd been going and because the Gray's tracks in the snow were still readable, fresh enough that the wind hadn't smoothed them yet. The tracks told a story he read at a canter. 2 sets out, the Gray and the smaller boots of Evelyn walking beside her on the soft sections, then just the Gray coming back. The return tracks were wider gated, the prints shallower on one side, the track of an unloaded horse moving fast. He found the ice break at the lower bend of the creek. The hole was 3 feet across, refreezing at the edges already, the broken ice pushed to the sides. 1 set of tracks went in. 1 set of tracks, the horses, came out the other side and curved back around. The boot prints that had been beside the Gray's tracks on the outward journey were not in the return. She'd gone into the water. He did not stop at the creek. He read the tracks on the far bank, Gray heading back, boot prints continuing north along the bank, and followed the boot prints. They were uneven, the right foot dragging slightly more than the left, the stride shorter than it had been on the outward tracks, getting shorter as he followed them. The tracks left the bank and turned toward the field behind the barn's east side. He found the Gray standing near the cottonwood still, like she'd been waiting, and he found Evelyn at the base of the tree. She was sitting with her back against the trunk and her knees pulled toward her chest and her eyes open, which was the thing that mattered most in that first second. Her eyes were open. But they were working slowly, the way eyes work when the body has redirected every resource toward the core and the periphery has gone quiet. "Gideon." She said it like she'd been expecting him, which she had been. He was off the roan and beside her in the same motion. He got his hands on her face first, the standard assessment, the thing you did. And her skin was the cold of something that had been outside a long time, past the first stage of cold into the second, the one that stopped feeling like temperature and started feeling like the absence of something. "Can you move your feet?" he said. A pause. "Too long." "I think so." "Don't think. Do it." Another pause. "Yes." "Hands?" She lifted her right hand. It moved, but not well. The fingers not closing properly, the grip gone. He didn't waste time on the assessment beyond that. He pulled the heavy blanket from the roan's back and got it around her, all of it, tucking it at the sides the way you banked a fire. Not for comfort, but for containment, stopping the loss before anything else. Then he pulled off his own coat. "No," she said. "You need that. I need you warm. There's a difference." He put the coat over the blanket and held it there with one hand while he worked the saddlebag open with the other. He had dry wool in the bag. He always had dry wool in the bag, a lesson from his second winter on the ranch when a less serious version of this had taught him the cost of not being prepared. He got her wet gloves off, which took longer than it should have because his own hands were cold now and she couldn't help. He put the dry wool ones on her. "I went onto the ice," she said. "I know." The horse hesitated. "I overrode it." "I know that too." She was quiet for a moment. He was working on getting the saddlebag's hot water flask open. He'd wrapped it in the wool, kept it insulated, and it was still warm, not hot, but warm enough for what he needed. "You should say something," she said. "About what?" "About the ice. About the decision." He looked at her. Her face was too pale, and her lips had a color that he didn't like, but her eyes were clearer than they'd been 20 seconds ago. The voice was doing something, the effort of speaking pulling her back toward herself. "Here." He got the flask open and held it to her mouth. "Drink." She drank. It was plain water, warm, and she got 3 swallows down before he took it away. Not too much, not fast. "I'm waiting," she said. "For what?" "For you to tell me it was stupid." "It was stupid," he said. He said it the way he said things he considered settled facts. No heat in it, no satisfaction, just accuracy. "Drink again." She drank again. "That's it? That's all you have?" "What do you want me to say?" "I don't know. Something more than that." He got his arm around her, over the blanket, and pulled her against his side because contact warmth was the next thing and standing on ceremony about it was not a luxury either of them had right now. She was rigid with cold and then, by degrees, not. The horse was right, he said. You knew it was. You went anyway. Yes. Why? She was quiet long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then, because I wanted to finish what I said I'd do. I wanted to be back by 3. I wanted... She stopped. To prove you belonged out here. The pause that followed that had a different quality than the others. He felt it in the way her shoulder moved against him. Yes, she said. Something like that. He didn't say anything for a moment. The wind was at the cottonwood's back and the trunk was giving them something. Not enough, but something. Evelyn. He said her name the way he didn't often say it, not as a header for an instruction, but as the thing itself. You don't have to prove that. I know that intellectually. Knowing it intellectually is not the same as knowing it. No, she agreed, it isn't. He judged the color in her face again. Better, not good. Not good enough to stay here any longer, but better. Can you ride? Don't think. Yes. She said it more firmly. Yes, I can ride. Getting her up was not easy. Her legs were not cooperating fully, and he had to take most of her weight, which she let him do with only a brief instinct of resistance before the practical reality of the situation overcame it. He got her on the roan, and then, because there was no other workable arrangement, got up behind her and kept her in the blanket and put his arms around her to hold the reins. She leaned back against him. Not dramatically, just settled, the way exhausted people settle when they've stopped having the resources to hold themselves at a careful distance. He didn't say anything about it. He held the reins and turned the roan toward the ranch and kept the pace steady and watched the sky over the ridge with the ongoing calculation of a man moving through a situation that had more variables than he'd like. The fence line, she said after a while. I found the posts. There's one that needs replacing before the hard freeze. I wrote it in the notebook. A pause. The notebook's in my coat pocket. I don't know if it got wet. We'll check the notebook later. It matters. The post will wait. You won't. He said it flatly, not ungently. The two things were not mutually exclusive. She was quiet after that. He could feel her breathing, the steadiness of it improving, deepening, as the wool in the blanket and his body heat did their collective work. The roan moved through the snow with the reliable patience of a well-trained animal. The ranch lights came into view when the last of the flat gray light was giving out. Samuel had lit the yard lamp, which meant he'd been watching from the barn door, and by the time they reached the yard, he was there with the barn already open. Heifer's fine, Samuel said, taking the roan's head. His eyes went to Evelyn and said the rest without words. Heat water, Gideon said. Everything we've got. He got her inside and near the stove and out of the wet coat and into dry things with the focused efficiency of someone who has reduced the situation to its components and is addressing them in order. She was more functional than she'd been at the cottonwood. The ride had helped, or the blanket, or whatever internal reserve she'd been running on. But her hands were still not right, and he kept watching her face for the signs that would mean the situation was more serious than it appeared. He made her drink warm water, then broth from the pot he'd left on the back of the stove that morning. She held the mug herself, which he noted. By the time she'd finished it, some color had come back that hadn't been there before. She was sitting at the kitchen table wrapped in 2 blankets and wearing his heaviest wool socks, which were enormous on her, and she looked simultaneously terrible and considerably better than she had looked 40 minutes ago. Your hands, he said. She held them out. The fingers were moving properly now, the grip coming back. There was some redness that was going to be uncomfortable for a few days, but the color was normal. No white patches, no gray. He'd seen frostbite, and this wasn't it, which was the one piece of genuine luck in the afternoon. I'm all right, she said. You're not all right. You're better than you were. That's the same thing you said about the south pasture. He looked at her. She was watching him with eyes that were clear and tired and carrying something he recognized from the cottonwood. That particular human expression that was not quite guilt and not quite fear, but lived in the territory between them. Stop, he said. I haven't said anything. You're about to say something you've been composing since the creek, and I want you to stop. She closed her mouth, then opened it. You can't tell me not to say, I can tell you to wait until you're warm. I'm warm enough. He sat down across from her. Not because he planned to. He was going to check the heifers again. but because something in the evening had a gravity he wasn't going to argue with. "All right," he said. "Say it." She looked at him steadily. The kitchen was warm, the fire doing its proper work, the lamp making the room smaller and closer than it was in daylight. "I misjudged you," she said, "when I stepped off the train. I looked at you and I made a decision about what I was looking at, and I was wrong, and I've known I was wrong for a long time, but tonight—" She stopped, looked down at the mug in her hands. "Tonight, I was sitting against that tree, and I was thinking your name. Not because I expected anything, just because you are, the thing I think of when I need something solid." He didn't answer immediately. He was looking at her with the full attention he usually gave to things he was assessing carefully, but there was something else in it now, that quarter-inch opening, and this time it didn't close. "I told you in a letter once," he said slowly, "that real understanding takes time." "You did." "I meant it in a general sense. I didn't know I was writing it about us." She looked up. "Were you?" "I think I was writing it about everything and meaning it about you specifically, and not knowing that yet." He turned the coffee mug in his hands. He'd made coffee at some point, reflexively, the way he always did when thinking. "The day you arrived. You looked at me and I saw what you saw. I've always known what I look like. I told you that on the wagon." "You did." "What I didn't tell you is that I stood on that platform and watched you get off that train and thought—" He stopped, cleared his throat in the way that meant he was moving through territory he didn't have pre-worn paths across. "I thought, she came. After 11 months of letters and arguments and me being exactly what I am on paper, she came. That meant something. Before you even looked at me." Evelyn set down the mug. "I almost got back on the train," she said. "You should know that. I stood on the platform with my hat box and I almost got back on the train." "I know." She stared at him. "How do you know?" "Because I watched you decide not to." He said it without drama. "I saw the moment you decided. I didn't know what you were deciding, but I saw the deciding of it." He paused. "I was grateful." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind was working at the eaves, and somewhere in the barn a heifer was making the particular noise that meant her time was closer, and the whole machinery of the ranch was running around them with its usual indifferent requirement. And inside the kitchen, neither of them moved. "I was wrong about you," she said again, "from the first second. And then I spent 6 months being slowly, specifically proven wrong about every assumption I'd made, and I didn't say anything because—" She looked at him. "Because I didn't know how to say it without it sounding like I was admitting I'd been an idiot." "You weren't an idiot." "I was making decisions based on insufficient data." "That's just being human." "You weren't. You never—" She stopped. "You never looked at me the way I looked at you that first day. You never made an assumption about what I was that I then had to overcome." He was quiet for a moment. "I made assumptions." "What assumptions?" "That you'd leave by spring, that the ranch would be too hard, that a woman who'd grown up with parlors and tea circles and a housemaid named Maggie couldn't—" He paused. "Couldn't do what you've done. Couldn't become what you've become here." She absorbed this. "When did you stop assuming that?" He thought about it honestly. "When you reorganized the storage shed wrong, and then reorganized it right, and didn't need me to tell you it was right." A pause. "And when you held that fence post on the east line and your hands were numb and you didn't say a word about it." She laughed. A short, real, unguarded sound that the kitchen hadn't heard before in quite that form. It startled him slightly, which she saw. "Sorry," she said. "Don't apologize for it." He was looking at her with the open expression. The door opened more than a quarter inch now, more than he usually allowed. "I like that sound." She looked back at him. "Gideon?" "Yes. I'm not going to leave. I want you to know that. Not in spring. Not any spring." He held her gaze. "I know." "Do you?" "I've known since February." He said it simply. "You stopped bolting the door." She went still. Then, "You noticed that." "I notice most things." The heifer's noise from the barn got louder and more insistent. He should go. He needed to go. He stayed for another 10 seconds anyway, which was, For Gideon Hale, approximately the equivalent of a declaration. Then he stood. "I need to check the barn." "Go." She pulled the blankets tighter. "I'll have something on the stove when you come back. You'll sit there and be warm." "I'll sit here and be warm and also have something on the stove. I can do both. My hands work now." He looked at her for one more moment. "The notebook," she said. "My coat pocket. The post on the east line. It's the third from the junction marker, and it needs replacing before—" Evelyn. "Before the next hard freeze, which by my reading of the sky is—" "Evelyn." "What?" "The post will be there tomorrow," he said. "You nearly weren't." She was quiet. "That's the only thing that matters tonight," he said, and went to the barn. She sat in the kitchen for a long time after he left, wrapped in his blankets and his wool socks, listening to the wind work at the house. The house held. It always held. She understood now that this was not luck but intention. The result of a man who had gone over every roof section and every window frame and every load-bearing beam with the same methodical care he applied to everything that mattered to him. She got up, carefully, and went to the stove. Her legs cooperated. Her hands cooperated. The cold had retreated to a distant ache in her fingers and a tiredness in her bones that she knew would be worse tomorrow and was manageable tonight. She found the broth he'd made, not just the pot he'd left that morning. There was a second one, started recently, the stock still simmering, and she understood that at some point in the afternoon, before she'd come back, before he'd known anything was wrong, he had simply put a second pot on for her return. Because she'd said 3 o'clock, and he'd believed her, and he had wanted her to come back to something warm. She stood at the stove and held that knowledge for a moment, turning it over the way she turned over things she wanted to understand. Then she put a pan on beside the broth pot and started making what she could with what was available, which was what the ranch had always required of both of them. 40 minutes later, Gideon came back in from the barn with snow on his shoulders and the particular satisfaction of a man who'd seen a heifer through her first calf without complication. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. She had set the table. There was food on it. Nothing complicated, nothing that required hands at full function, but real food, hot food. The kitchen warm and the lamp lit, and the whole room wearing the particular quality of an evening that has come through something and landed somewhere better than it might have. He looked at her. She looked back at him. "The heifer?" she asked. "Good. Healthy calf. Bull." A pause. "Strong one. Write it in the records in the morning. We'll need the birth date for the spring assessment." "I know." She sat down. He sat down across from her. He had taken off his coat and his snow-crusted outer layer in the entry, and he was in his work shirt with his sleeves pushed up and his weathered hands flat on the table, and he was looking at the food she'd made with an expression that had nothing careful in it at all. That was just what it was. "It's not elegant," she said. "I told you in a letter once," he said, "that the meals wouldn't be elegant." "You did." "I didn't specify which of us would be responsible for that." She felt the laugh coming up and let it. It was easier than before, less guarded. He watched it with the door open. They ate. The wind outside argued with the house, and the house declined to be argued with. Somewhere in the barn, a new calf that was apparently strong stood for the first time on the cold, clean straw, and the ranch went on in all its difficult, requiring particular way. Later, when the dishes were done and the fire banked for the night, she found the coat he'd put over the blanket at the cottonwood. It was hanging on the peg by the door where she'd put it without thinking, still damp at the hem. She stood looking at it for a moment. She thought about what it had cost him. Not the physical cold of riding without it, though that was real. The other cost. The man who did not perform care, who had never in his life done a tender thing for the theater of it, who had ridden into a November storm and taken the coat off his own back and put it over hers because the arithmetic was simple, and he'd done the calculation without hesitating. She took it off the peg and hung it more carefully, smoothing the canvas across the shoulders. She would remember this later, in years she couldn't yet see, looking back from a distance that would make this evening appear small and clear and essential, the way distant things sometimes clarify, as the night she stopped understanding Gideon Hale in pieces and understood him whole. Not perfectly, not without the remaining friction of two people whose stubbornness would go on producing arguments and revisions and 10-day compromises for decades. Not without the difficulties that were still ahead of them, the droughts and the losses and the hard years that Wyoming had not finished presenting. but whole. The complete shape of him, finally visible. The hard part is getting to where you can see the shape. She went to bed that night without bolting the door. She hadn't bolted it in 9 months. But tonight it meant something different. Not the absence of fear, but the presence of something she trusted more than the absence of fear. She slept better than she had since Philadelphia. Possibly better than she had ever slept in Philadelphia. Outside, the storm worked through its business and moved on, the way storms did, leaving the world scoured and cold and very clear. The east fence post got replaced on a Saturday in late November, 3 days after the storm, when the ground had settled back into its frozen patience and Evelyn's hands had recovered enough to hold a tool properly. She and Gideon did it together, which had not been the plan. He'd intended to do it himself, and she'd put on her coat and her lined gloves and followed him out the door without discussion. And he'd looked at her once and handed her the post without comment. It took 40 minutes. The new timber went in solid. She wrote it in the records that evening. East fence line, post 3 from junction marker, replaced November 23rd. Ground condition, firm. Post set depth, standard. No further issues noted along the line. And then in the margin, in the smaller handwriting she used for observations rather than facts. 3 days late. Still got done. Gideon read it over her shoulder, which he'd been doing since October without either of them acknowledging it as a habit. He didn't say anything, but she heard, just behind her, the quiet exhale that was his version of a smile. The winter that followed the storm was the hardest they'd had. January came in with the kind of serious intention that even the old-timers in Clearwater Junction discussed in the voice people use for things that deserve respect. 3 weeks of temperatures that dropped below zero at night and barely recovered during the day, winds that moved the snow horizontally across the flats. 2 stretches of road isolation that lasted 9 days combined. They were prepared. They had done the math in October, and the math had been right. 90 days of feed, 60 of provisions, the creek access from the east pasture holding open until the 15th of January when it finally iced over, exactly as the records had predicted it would, based on the margin note Gideon had added the previous winter. They lost 2 cattle, 1 heifer to a respiratory issue that no amount of preparation would have prevented, and 1 older bull to the cold on a night that was simply beyond what any management system could fully account for. 2 was not nothing. 2 was considerably better than it could have been. On the 9th day of the second road isolation, with the thermometer reading 17 below and the wind making the barn creak in its joints, Calvin Briggs arrived on horseback, looking like a man who had made a poor decision approximately halfway through carrying it out. Evelyn opened the door before he knocked. "Cal, I need to borrow your husband," he said. His face was the deep red of genuine cold, past the stage where it was merely uncomfortable. "North section water trough froze solid. Cattle can't drink. I can't break it alone." "Come inside first." "I should—" "Come inside, Cal." She stepped back and held the door. He came inside. She put coffee in his hands before he'd finished unwrapping his scarf. Gideon was already pulling on his outer coat. He'd heard the voice at the door and assembled the situation in the time it took Evelyn to make the coffee. 2 hours, he told her. "I know. Go." He went. She stood at the kitchen window and watched the two of them ride out into the white flat cold, Gideon's posture on the horse as steady and untroubled as if he were riding to check a fence in mild October weather. And she thought, not for the first time, about what it cost a person to be that reliable. Not the physical cost, though that was real, and she'd watched it accumulate across a winter. The other cost, the one that came from being the person others came to because you had never given them a reason to think you wouldn't come through. She understood it better now than she had in November, sitting against the cottonwood with her hands useless and the cold doing its methodical work. She understood what it had cost him to ride out into that storm. Not just the cold, the not knowing, the gray coming back alone, and the 3 seconds in the yard, and all the calculations that led him out the gate at a pace the ground could handle, and no slower. She thought about that cost often in the years that followed. It shaped something in her. They came back in under 2 hours, both of them ice-crusted, and Cal looking considerably warmer in the internal sense than he had arriving. She had soup on and dry socks by the fire, and neither man commented on this, which she'd stopped expecting them to and which no longer bothered her. "Nora's going to want to do something for you," Cal told her over the soup. "She'll bring something when the road opens." "Tell her not to." "You know Nora." "Tell her anyway. We're neighbors." That's what neighbors are. Cal looked at her with the assessing expression she'd seen from him before, the revised estimate. Then he looked at Gideon, who was eating soup with the focused attention of a man who needed the calories. You did all right, Cal told him, with the studied understatement that men of that county used for things that mattered considerably more than their tone implied. She did the math, Gideon said, meaning the preparedness, the records, the feed calculations. He said it plainly, without performance, the way he attributed true things. Cal absorbed this. Yes, he said, I expect she did. The road opened on January 28th. The rest of the winter passed hard, but not disastrously. Spring came late and grudgingly, the way Wyoming springs often did, not arriving so much as slowly overcoming resistance, the snow retreating by inches, the mud season arriving with its own particular difficulties, the cattle coming through in better numbers than the winter had seemed likely to allow. The final operating figures for the year went into the ledger in April. Evelyn recorded them in her careful hand and then sat back and looked at the numbers for a long moment. She called Gideon in from the porch. He came to the table and looked at the page. He said nothing for a moment, reading the figures with the focused attention he brought to things he considered important. That's, he started. The best year in the ranch's history, she said, by a margin that makes last year's best look modest. He sat down. He ran his finger down the operating column the way he did when he was verifying, not disbelieving, but making sure the certainty was earned. The Whitmore situation helped, he said, keeping the water access. Yes, and the early rotation, and the feed system, and the drainage fix in the east pasture. She paused. And selling the replacement heifers in March instead of waiting for the summer market. That was your call? You agreed with it. After you showed me the futures analysis. He looked up. Evelyn. What? This is... He stopped. Started again. I've been running this ranch for 12 years. I've never seen numbers like this. We've been running this ranch, she said, not correcting him, just adjusting the accounting. He held her gaze across the table. The kitchen was morning bright, the spring light coming in at that particular angle that made everything look like a beginning. We've been running this ranch, he agreed. Something passed between them that was not said and did not need to be. Ruth Albright came to visit that summer, which had required considerable negotiation between her desire to see Evelyn and her complicated feelings about trains, and she arrived at Clearwater Junction looking both exhausted and determined in equal measure. Wearing a hat that was extremely Philadelphia and carrying enough luggage to suggest she was less certain than she claimed to be about the length of her stay, Evelyn met her at the platform. They embraced in the way of women who have been close friends since 16 and have been apart for a year and a half, which is to say with complete disregard for composure. You look different, Ruth said, holding her at arm's length. I'm the same person. You're absolutely not. Ruth was studying her with the frank attention that had always been her particular quality. You look, I don't know, like you fit somewhere. Evelyn laughed. Get in the wagon. Gideon met them at the ranch in the yard, and Ruth shook his hand with the careful composure of a woman who had spent 18 months hearing about this man in letters and was now conducting a quiet and thorough assessment. He submitted to it with his usual unruffled patience. Mr. Hale, Ruth said. Mrs. Albright. He picked up her trunks, 2 of them. I'll put these in the back bedroom. Ruth watched him carry them to the house. Then she turned to Evelyn with an expression that said several things at once, none of which required words. Yes, Evelyn said. I didn't say anything. You were extremely loud about it. Ruth looked at the house, then at Evelyn. He's not what I expected from the letters. No, Evelyn agreed. He never is. Ruth stayed 2 weeks. She helped in the kitchen and was occasionally useful in the records room and was completely useless on horseback, which she acknowledged with the cheerful self-awareness of a woman who had not spent the last year and a half riding fence lines. She and Gideon developed a careful, mutually respectful wariness, like 2 animals of different species who have assessed each other and concluded, not a threat, not a natural ally, but workable. On her last evening, Ruth sat with Evelyn on the porch in the summer dark, while Gideon was in the barn for the evening check. Tell me something honest, Ruth said. About what? About this. Ruth gestured at the ranch, the dark shapes of the mountains, the particular silence that pressed in from all sides after sundown. Evelyn thought about it. Not long. The honest answer was not complicated anymore, though it had taken a while to arrive at. "It's harder than anything I've ever done," she said, "and it's more mine than anything I've ever had." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "Are you happy?" Evelyn considered the question the way it deserved to be considered. Not quickly, not with the reflexive reassurance she might have given a year ago. She thought about the ledger with their combined handwriting in it. She thought about the east fence post and the storm and the soup she'd had on when Gideon came back from Briggs's north section. She thought about arguments over Chapter 4 and 10-day compromises and the sound of him in the barn in the early morning, moving through the feeding schedule with that steady, purposeful rhythm that had become one of the sounds she organized her days around. "Yes," she said. Not in a simple way, but yes. Ruth nodded slowly. "He loves you," she said. "I don't think he's said it, but it's in everything he does." "I know." "Have you said it?" Evelyn looked at the barn lights. "Not in those words." "Evelyn, some things don't require the specific word. They require the specific action." She paused. "I stayed. That was my word." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the dry precision that had always been her particular gift, "I'm going to tell you that's either the most romantic thing I've ever heard or a massive rationalization, and I'm genuinely not sure which." Evelyn laughed. It carried out into the dark Wyoming night and went somewhere. She said the word eventually. Not on Ruth's schedule. One morning in late October of the second year, the anniversary of the storm approaching and the mountains already carrying their first serious snow, she was at the kitchen table with the records, and Gideon was at the stove, and she looked up and said it without planning to, the way some true things emerge. Not when you've prepared them, but when they've simply become too present to stay inside. He turned from the stove. He looked at her for a moment with that fully open expression, the door not a quarter inch, but all the way. "I know," he said, and then quietly, "I do too." It was not a scene from a novel. He did not cross the room and take her face in his hands. He turned back to the stove and finished what he was doing, and she turned back to the records, and they had breakfast, and the morning went on in all its ordinary, requiring way. But she wrote in the margin of the records book that morning, in the small handwriting she used for observations, "Year 2, still here," and then, after a pause, added, "Better than I knew how to imagine." He read it that evening. She knew he had because the next morning there was a single line added beneath hers, in his careful, slightly slanted script, "Same." The years that followed were not a series of triumphs. Evelyn would have been suspicious of anyone who described them that way, because she had come to understand that the ranch, and the life it contained, was not a thing you triumphed over. It was a thing you maintained, daily, stubbornly, with imperfect tools and imperfect judgment, and the ongoing willingness to revise what you thought you knew. There was a drought in the 5th year that cost them 30 head and required the kind of financial decisions that kept both of them up at night running numbers against outcomes. Trying to find the path through that didn't require selling the north section. They found it, barely, by selling the replacement stock early and taking a contract grazing arrangement with a neighboring ranch that Gideon negotiated and Evelyn documented, and they came through it with the ranch intact and a knowledge of their own limits that was uncomfortable and necessary. There were hard winters and good springs, and one summer that was so productive the ledger numbers looked implausible until she'd checked them twice and made Gideon check them once more. There were arguments that lasted 3 days, and resolutions that were neither clean nor complete but were honest, which was what they had always valued over clean. There were mornings when the ranch felt like a weight they carried, and evenings when it felt like the most specifically right thing in the world. Their children came, 3 of them, across 8 years. Each one arrived into a household that was structured and loving and occasionally loud, and completely without the pretense of effortlessness. Evelyn had learned too much about honest work to pretend that motherhood was natural or instinctive or anything other than the hardest and most specific challenge she had ever applied herself to. She applied herself to it the way she applied herself to everything, with full attention, with a willingness to revise, and with the ongoing acknowledgement that she was making it up at the same time she was doing it. Gideon was not a demonstrative father. He taught by proximity and example, which was how he did everything. Their eldest, a daughter named Clara, had his capacity for focused observation, and her mother's appetite for systems, which combined to make her a child who kept meticulous notes on the behavior of the ranch animals and presented her findings at the dinner table with the confidence of someone who had been listened to by two serious adults for her entire life. "She's going to be formidable," Gideon told Evelyn once, watching Clara at the table with her notebook. "She already is," Evelyn said. "Gets it from somewhere." "From several places," Evelyn said, and left it there. The ranch grew. Not explosively. They were never people who expanded for the sake of expansion, having both seen what overextension did to the ranches around them, but steadily, with the same incremental care they applied to everything. By the time the children were grown, Hale Ranch was 120 head larger than when Evelyn had arrived, with a water management system that 3 neighboring ranches had adopted in modified form, and a records methodology that the Territorial Agricultural Office had used as the basis for a recommended practice guide, a fact that Gideon mentioned once and never again. The Mercer brothers, Doyle and Wade, who had said in Halston's feed store that Gideon had gone soft, were still operating their ranch 20 years later at roughly the same scale they'd been at before, having lost significant ground to 2 bad droughts they hadn't prepared for. Doyle had once, at a territory gathering in Gideon's hearing, referred to the Hale Ranch management approach as the way things are going now, without any particular acknowledgement that he'd spent years calling it something else. Gideon had let this pass without comment, which Evelyn privately considered one of his finer achievements. She thought about that sometimes, about what it meant to be right and not require the credit. He had always been that way. She had taken longer to learn it. She wasn't sure she'd fully learned it even now, but she'd learned it better than she had at 28 on a wagon from Clearwater Junction, which was what growth actually looked like. Not transformation, but direction. The coat hung on its peg by the barn door for 30 years. Not the same peg. They'd rebuilt the barn entry in the 15th year, and she'd moved the coat to the new peg herself, smoothing it across the shoulders the way she'd done the night of the storm. It was too worn to be practical, too important to discard. It occupied the peg the way certain things occupy space, not as decoration, but as fact. Gideon never mentioned it. Occasionally visitors asked about it, and Evelyn would say simply that it was her husband's coat and leave it there. When Gideon died, in the 32nd year of their marriage, in January, of a heart that had worked very hard for 66 years and finally indicated it had done sufficient, he went in the way she had always somehow expected he would go. Not dramatically, not fighting it. He woke in the night, woke her with the stillness of him beside her, and said, "I think something's wrong," which were the most alarmed words she had ever heard him use, and which told her everything. She held his hand through the hours that followed. She talked to him, which she had always done better than he had. She told him about the ledger numbers from the previous fall, which were the best since the drought year's recovery. She told him the east fence line was in good shape. She told him Clara's youngest had his eyes. He died with her hand in his at 4 in the morning, when the January sky outside was the deep clear black of a cold that had come off the mountains with serious intent. She sat with him for a while before she called anyone. She thought about the platform at Clearwater Junction and the man who had crossed it in 8 strides and held out his hand for a handshake. She thought about the first letter. I stay. When things get hard, I stay. She thought about the cottonwood tree and the gray coming back alone and the sound of hooves in the yard with the rhythm that was wrong. She thought about how long it had taken her to see the shape of him, and how completely she had seen it once she had, and how the shape had not changed in 32 years. Only clarified, the way things clarify when you have known them long enough. She went to the barn entry at first light, before she called Calvin Briggs, before she told the children. She stood in front of the coat on its peg. She put her hand on the canvas shoulder, the way she had that first night. It was cold to the touch. It was worn through at the left elbow, where he'd always carried the fence tools. It smelled like the barn and the cold, and the particular combination of things that had been the smell of her life for 32 years. She left it on the peg. Clara found her there, a half hour later. Clara, who had her father's stillness and her mother's precision, and who stood beside her without speaking for a long moment in the way her father would have stood. "He was a good man," Clara said finally. "He was a great one," Evelyn said. "I almost missed it entirely." Clara looked at her. "The train platform?" "Yes." "You've never told that story to us, the full version." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. The morning light was coming in through the barn entry, the particular winter light of a cold, clear day, and the ranch was waking around them the way it always woke. The cattle beginning to move, Samuel's replacement of 20 years making sounds in the equipment shed, the whole machinery of the place proceeding with its usual indifferent requirement. She looked at her daughter, this woman who had been born into a life built on the lesson Evelyn had learned the hard way and spent 30 years trying to embody. The short version, she said, is that I stepped off a train and looked at a man and decided I knew what I was looking at, and I was completely wrong. Clara nodded slowly. And the long version? Evelyn looked at the coat, at the worn canvas and the missing button on the second buttonhole and the left elbow that had given out under the years of use. The long version, she said, is everything that came after. She took the coat off the peg and folded it over her arm and carried it back to the house, because the barn was cold and the coat needed to be somewhere warmer, and because some things deserved to be brought inside. The ranch went on. That was the last true thing about it, and also the first. It went on. The records she had built in that first winter were still the foundation of the management system, updated and expanded across 3 decades, cross-referenced and revised and occasionally argued over. The east fence line was in good repair. The north pasture drainage was managed. The figures in the ledger for that year, the year Gideon died, were the best in the ranch's history, which was a fact she would have found ironic, except that she understood it too well for irony. This was what he had built. This was what they had built. It did not require him present to continue being true. She ran the ranch for another 11 years after he died, with Clara and eventually Clara's husband taking on the physical work as her own body made its opinions increasingly known. She kept the records herself until her 80th year, when her handwriting became less reliable than her standards permitted, and she handed the ledger to Clara's youngest, the one with Gideon's eyes, with the same matter-of-fact gravity with which she had first built it, sitting at a kitchen table in the first winter, while a man she had not yet understood moved around the ranch with quiet, purposeful competence. She told people occasionally, in the last years, when they asked about the ranch and how it had become what it was. We figured out that 2 people seeing things differently is not a problem. It's the whole point. She was not sure she had believed that on the wagon from Clearwater Junction. She was not sure she had known how to believe it then. It was the kind of knowledge that couldn't be told, only accumulated, slowly, in the particular currency of shared winters and honest disagreements and the daily choice to stay when staying required something. The coat remained in the house, on a peg by the kitchen door, for the rest of her life. She never replaced the button on the second buttonhole. She never repaired the elbow. Some things are more honest as they are.